And it was a much quieter environment. In 1985, the focus in the room is on the mother's comfort so that that mother can deliver this child as quickly, efficiently, and safely as possible so that they can move on to the next birthing suite. Because the hospital model says we have to generate revenue. This is very assembly line, right? 1960, the focus was on the mother's pain. The focus was on bringing this baby into the world in this fairly rudimentary environment, especially by today's standards, right? The sense of urgency in the room was more around that safety of the child itself than moving on to the next birthing suite. And it's a very quiet environment, greeted mostly by people. So the stimulus level is much lower. Now I want to make a point of this because when you think about it, starting with Gen X and especially with Gen Y, these are humans that have been bombarded by stimulus since birth. Literally since birth. They have been bombarded by stimulus of some form. And not just any stimulus. It's usually been a stimulus designed specifically to have them make a decision or act on something now. Right? It's everywhere. I'm not talking just about machines in a birthing room. I'm not talking just about television. I'm talking about get on an airplane, pull down the table. There's an advertisement on the table. It's everywhere you look. It's billboards, it's internet, it's email, it's texting, it's telephone calls, it's spam. It's in the elevators, it's in the restrooms. They are being bombarded with information and stimulus every second of their life, relatively involuntarily. Relatively involuntarily. So here's the crux of this. So here we have these people that have been born into a world where they're bombarded with stimulus and information since birth, and we stick them in a school system that has an educational system that was born in the 40s and has been revised about twice, and we wonder why they act out, why they get bored. What do they see at home? Video games, television, constant advertisements, constant information. They get on the computer at 3. And they're constantly being stimulated. They're constantly getting smarter. They're being given information. And the conversations that their parents and the adults in their circle around them are having right in front of them are far more sophisticated than conversations have ever been at kids their age, ever. And we wonder why they get bored in school. You know, and because we are who we are, and we grew up in the situations that we grew up in, we don't understand it. So we call it ADD and put them on drugs. And I'm sorry, my personal opinion about that is that's a crime. You know, that shows our lack of adaptability. Right? These people are high energy, high flow, I need stimulus. You know, in the words of Kurt Cobain, entertain us. That's what they're looking for. So when our school system doesn't step up to that, what do? They act out. I'm bored. I'm going to create some stimulus, right? So that's kind of, again, that's where advancement and evolution has led us. So we have to be ready to deal with that. This is their world. This is what they're growing up in. You know, it's overload. I love the Time magazine cover. Are our kids too wired for their own good? Again, how many people in here have kids under, how many people have kids under 13? How many of them have asked for a cell phone under 13? How many of you have given them a cell phone under 13? Yeah. Well, you know, when you're out and I don't know where you are, I want to be able to access you and you to be able to text all your friends. Right? The $300 text bill shows up in the mail. Whoa, wait a minute. But this is their environment. It's constant stimulus. It's overload. They are also physically growing up faster. This is my niece at 2. No kidding. This tall at 2. Now granted, I'm cheating a little here. Her dad's 6'7". So there's some genetics going on here, okay? But my point here is two things. Number one, she's not atypical. Kids are physically getting bigger, faster, because of the growth hormones and steroids and chemicals we put in our food at every single stage along the way. Humans are getting bigger quicker. And not just on the outside. The inside's getting bigger too, in two ways. One, the brain is actually growing quicker. Therefore, it's able to take in information and process it sooner than, say, 50 years ago. And this is medically proven stuff, not conjecture. At the same time, glands like the amygdala, which control judgment, still don't mature until about age 22. So, you know, we're still, like, I can speak for myself, we're still jumping off roofs and landing on flat feet and doing stupid things, you know, where judgment is low. I'm sorry? You're thinking 32? Secondly, especially in Leah's case, I find this most interesting myself because she's taller than most kids her age. She looks 2 to 5 years older than she really is, or at least we would expect her to be, right? So when any adult interfaces with this person, they interface with someone who's 2 to 5 years older than they really are. Now tell me that doesn't make someone grow up quicker. I find myself doing it. I know how old she is, and yet I still talk with her like she's a 10-year-old, and she's 6. She's just turned 6 or about to turn 6. So, you know, she's growing up faster, and she's smart. She's very smart, and that is not atypical. Again, I've interviewed a lot of smaller, younger people, you know, 5, 6, 7, and not like a technical interview, but just sat down and had conversations, and it blows my mind how smart and aware these kids are. So they are physically growing up faster. The thing about it is, like I say, it's all following the tech curve. It's all about where we are technologically. You look back at the boomers, and there's my bag phone, right? Anybody remember those? Yeah, you know, the dialing phones instead of the push-button phones? Absolutely. You know, some whole households only had one. You had to go to that room to talk on the phone.
And party lines.
Nope, and party lines, absolutely. My definition of a video game was 2 vertical lines that did this and a dot that went back and forth, right? Pong, absolutely. And that was good for about an hour, and then we were back outside playing because it got really boring, right? Now, the video games of today, once you start, you know, people have to go in there and literally drag you away from it, unplug it from the wall, right? Because they are so immersive, and they are so stimulus. They're so high in stimulus. You know, our version of a computer was a Trash 80. Back in the, I remember that's what I started programming on back in the day. You know, we move up to the Xers. Now that's a completely different technological paradigm right there. Now we've got cube farms. Everyone has an actual, honest to goodness, can do work on it computer, right? We've got the birth of things like Dilbert, where we're actually making fun of ourselves using that technology and playing in that realm. And the quality of our entertainment has gone stratospherically high. We've got things like Star Wars, right? Now you move into Gen Y, and all of a sudden, again, it's a completely different jump. It's this huge leap in what's available to us as information. It's not just about the technology, it's the content that that technology can deliver. And that's where kids are getting smarter. You know, now we have, as opposed to our idols being the people we look up to, being parents, grandparents, business moguls, now we've got sports stars, Paris Hilton, people we see on television. Hannah Montana, exactly. And kids are starting on computers at 3, 2 and 3 years old. You know, you come home from a hard day's work and you got to check your email and your kid's in your spot and you stand behind them going, I don't know how to do that, right? And they're 7 or 8, right? So that's the environment that they grew up in. So what are the traits of these? Let's look at it from the context of how we relate to authority, innovation, creation, and rules, because this is where we work, right? Especially now in the financial industry. A lot of focus on rules and creation, right? The silent generation, they followed the rules because they assumed that the rules came from someone with authority. They were very conformist. And they were the age of conformity. That's just who they were. Somebody must know better than me. It's the industrial age. I need to make $1 to put food on my table. I'm going to do what you tell me to do. You move up to the baby boomers, they question the rules. Remember, me generation. They actually even bent some of them. I'm sorry?
Flower power.
Flower power, absolutely. They actually bent some of the rules, and they innovated the rules when necessary. They were protesters, right? Protesting Vietnam, protesting this. They just looked for things to protest. They were not necessarily nonconformist, but they questioned everything. Why should we do it this way? Why should we do it that way? Why can't we do it another way, right? We move up into the Gen X, smallest population out of all of them, and they broke the rules just to see what happened, right? I broke that rule and nothing happened, so let me go break this one. Let's see what happens now. Let's test the limits constantly. And this comes from basically being left to their own devices. When we look at this generation, it's really interesting. Again, not a lot of space between Gen X and Gen Y. Gen X used things like personal stereos, MP3 players, video games, things like that to check out. They literally disassociated themselves from their families, from one-to-one social networks in person. I've seen a lot of nodding heads, so this obviously must be familiar. Gen X basically used technology to check out. Gen Y used technology to plug in. All of a sudden, their social circle got really big, and it didn't really matter where they were. You look at Gen Y, they don't believe in rules. They just see guidelines, right? If I don't like the way the game is played here, I'll go somewhere else and play. Sound familiar? You know, we talk about there's no job loyalty today. Well, isn't it curious that none of the corporations provide any real means to have loyalty around? You look at Gen X, and they saw their parents who had worked for a company for 35 to 40 years not get a gold watch, but get a gold boot. You know, we don't need you anymore. I actually worked for First Union in the 80s myself. And I can remember when waves of layoffs occurred, 200 to 300 at a time, and it was literally you just got called to someone's office, handed your papers, escorted out the door, you were done. Gen X and Gen Y grew up seeing their parents go through that. And they said, why should I be loyal to something like that? Show me where that benefits me. And yet, in the corporate stature, we wonder why we can't find loyal employees.